Hi, I'm Maura McDonough, the director of the Hoya Writing Collective. Today, I'm joined by Ambassador Tatiana Gfoeller-Volkoff, former U.S. ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic, whose diplomatic career spanned postings in Poland, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the Soviet Union, Russia, Belgium, and Turkmenistan. She's also the author of two novels, A Simple Love and Becoming Virginia. This is the second episode of The Right Stuff, a GEMA Talks podcast by the Hoya Writing Collective. Today, we're exploring writing as a second act, including how to cultivate your passion for writing while building another career, successfully transition into becoming a novelist, and leverage your personal experience in service of your creative work. To start, we wanted to talk a little bit about your diplomacy background before getting into your career as a writer. And so, as a diplomat, how did you maintain your passion for fiction, and how did you hone your craft throughout your first career?
Actually, being a diplomat, particularly a political officer like I was during my 33-year career, it has a lot to do with writing. The job is to go out, meet people, talk to them, and report back to the ambassador, or eventually I became the ambassador to report back to the State Department, the state of play, how people in a country feel about things, what they're going to do about them. Now, there is an approach that is very by the book, very just the facts, ma'am. Report what's going on, no commentary, and that's it. That was never my approach. As I've said before, I love to write. And so my approach to diplomacy was to try and get the reader back home in DC to feel like they're in the same room with me as I'm talking to this foreign person I'm talking to make them feel like they're a participant in the discussion or just in the events that are unfolding in that country. Now, obviously, you have to stick to the facts in the sense that you can never imply things that were never actually told you. You can never put words in the mouth of your interlocutor just because you think that that's what he would have said had he been more open with you. No, no, no. That's completely verboten. But you can make things more human, more approachable to the reader back home. You can give it more of a human context to things. And I always love that part of the reporting job. And let me give you a couple of examples of that. So I was in Moscow at the end of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was crumbling. The people were abysmally poor. There was just despair in the air. The stores were bare. There was nothing to buy, no food, no products, no toys, of course, no nothing. And I would go around the streets just trying to kind of catch the vibe. And one day I'm walking on the Yobat, which is like a main quaint little street in the heart of Moscow. And I saw this long line of old ladies in their winter coats, and they were all standing around. And it turned out that miraculously, this little store had gotten a shipment of matryoshka dolls, the nesting dolls that the Russians are really famous for. And like most of these women hadn't seen, a matryoshka doll for sale in ages. And so the word was out, and they were all standing in line, and they were all chatting, and they were so excited about being able to buy one of these dolls, probably for a grandchild. And so I got in line with them, and I started just listening to the conversation, and they were talking about how they felt about the end of the Soviet Union. Everything was so up in the air. They were scared. At the same time, they were hopeful. Some of them were talking about maybe being able to start going to church again. Some of them had even heard about democracy. Others, on the contrary, were very, very fearful because what will happen if the Communist Party goes away and we have no one to protect us anymore? So it was a wonderful earful that I got. And so I came back to the embassy and I wrote it all up, immediately with the voices still ringing in my head. And believe it or not, even today, and I've been retired for more than 33 years, but even today, I'll go to a meeting with fellow State Department retirees, and somebody will sing out and say, "Oh, you were in the Soviet Union when it was falling apart. Did you ever read that Matryoshka cable? It was so cool. It made me feel, I was in Timbuktu, but it made me feel like I was in the streets of Moscow." And I will always say, "Well, I wrote that cable." And so it's funny how, these vignettes of life resonate. And actually, all joking aside, it was really important that malaise that the common woman in the street, the common middle-aged kind of forgotten woman in her winter coat in this dark, cold streets of Moscow was feeling at the time. So I think this is a pretty good example of how my passion for writing and my passion for politics, for international politics and what's going on in the world and how does it affect, just the little person. The two work really well together, and I enjoyed being able to put my two passions together. Now, I'll give you another example of where maybe things didn't work out as well. And that was when I was ambassador. I was the U.S. ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic, and Prince Andrew of the United Kingdom came to town. He was at the time the trade representative of the UK, worldwide trade representative. So he's in town and he invites me out to lunch, which was really cool. And we discuss this, that, and the other. And then, of course, I go back to the embassy and I write an I cable, which is a special cable that an ambassador writes directly to the Secretary of State. And I explained what we discussed. And there were some things that were quite, I thought, admirable about Prince Andrew, and some things were not as admirable. But stick to the facts. I gave, of course, in my patented and true manner, a bit of the context of how he was swaggering and how he was a bit condescending towards me. At one point, he said, "Well, what have you done to further British trade relations with the Kyrgyz Republic?" And I said, "Well, nothing, Your Royal Highness." And he said, well, why not? And I said, "Well, because I'm the ambassador of the United States of America, Your Royal Highness, and we've been not part of the British Empire since 1776. And he just laughed. Somebody else might have been offended. He just laughed and kind of made a funny gesture with his hand. And he said, "Oh, we won't let that get in the way." Stuff like that. And the way I'm talking about this right now on this podcast so openly is because even though this was a top secret cable, it was WikiLeaked and was splashed all over world newspapers, in particular, of course, UK newspapers. And this is where my writing skills kind of were a two-edged sword. Because on the one hand, it was funny, some journalists said, "Who knew that American diplomats can write so well?" And then others were not amused, particularly monarchists in the UK, pilloried me for criticizing the prince. One thing that was really trending was that I had propositioned him sexually and he had refused me, and therefore, no greater wrath than that of a woman scorned. And that's why I wrote all this trash about him. Ironically enough, Republicans, as with a small r in the UK, those who want to abolish the monarchy, loved me and wrote encomium about me. But bottom line being, my husband was traveling a lot in and out of London at that time, and he said, "Your face is on the front of every tabloid right now." So I didn't want to go to London. And for about a year, I stayed away. And then my tour in the Kyrgyz Republic was over. So friends of mine who lived in London invited me over. I came and stayed with them. And lo and behold, we were in the tube, as they call their metro. And I'm standing behind the gentleman who's sitting down. So I can't help but look down on him as I'm standing behind him. And he's opening up a tabloid, and my face is on the front. A
Okay.
year later, they're still talking about this cable of mine about Prince Andrew. So here, I'm afraid that I kind of went overboard with my novelistic approach to life, because I honestly would have much rather not have been talked about that much.
Yeah, so what's interesting is it seems like you still got to find an outlet for your creativity through I'll
hmm
call it your day job. I don't think anyone else would call diplomacy a day job, but it sounds like you still found this way to imbue it with creativity. But did you find it difficult to kind of mesh those worlds together? Because I imagine diplomacy, things are a lot more rigid, or there's certain protocols and ways you have to go about things. Then with writing, you have to be free. You have to be able to express yourself however you want. So is that maybe one of the reasons why you kind of almost had to segment it into two acts, into diplomacy and then later fiction? Like, tell me a little bit more about kind of this contrast.
Oh, absolutely. So um, I was in college and I knew I wanted to be a novelist, and I started sketching out two novels in my head. One was based on my junior year abroad that I did under the auspices of Georgetown University. I'm a grad, obviously, undergrad and master's degree program. And so I'd gone and done my junior year abroad in Italy and had encountered a lot of fascinating experiences. So I started jotting down an outline of a novel. And then I had another novel in mind. So, parallel, I'm very interested in international relations. I'm in the School of Foreign Service. I take the State Department exam and I pass and I'm offered a job. And I thought, great, I'll do my day job, as you said, and I'll keep writing my novels. Well, things did not turn out as easy as that because as soon as I was onboarded into the State Department, I met two entities which kind of crimped my style, at least as far as my novels were concerned. The first is the Censorship Bureau. Anything you write as a State Department official has to go through censorship before it is released for you to publish it. Even I wrote a nonfiction book, again, under the auspices of Georgetown University, when I was a professor at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I wrote about, it's called United by the Caspian. It's about American foreign policy and interests, both in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. So only the facts, ma'am, very dry, absolutely no novelistic license taken. But I still had to give it to the censors and they poured over it. They wanted to make sure I didn't review any classified information, wrote something offensive to any government or any entity. I mean, very, very strict. The second entity that I discovered up close and personal was diplomatic security. And they are, in a sense, even more fearsome because they're not just hunting around for you revealing embarrassing or classified information, which of course I wouldn't dream of doing. But they are looking for a very amorphous thing, which is sort of described as ability to serve basically your character, how you present yourself to the world. Will you embarrass the United States in any way, shape, or form? And so my novels, I'm sad to say, in a sense, would not affect muster. Obviously, they weren't revealing anything classified. But my first novel, set in Italy, and by the way, I just happen to have a copy right there. So let me show it. It's called Instant Pull Up under my name, and it was set at a time of the kind of the dawn of the age of AIDS, and it talked a lot about bisexuality and, of course, relationships between heterosexual, bisexual people, gay people. That was the focus. And let me tell you, this was the 80s. And in the 80s, diplomatic security was certainly said that a young woman who was writing about such subjects was probably unfit to represent the United States. So into the door with that draft novel. Then my second draft novel, okay, didn't have anything to do with bisexuality, but the premise is and was, and here it is, Becoming Virginia. It is about paranormal love. It is about can love actually lead to resurrection? Can you love someone who is dead? Very strange for diplomatic security. So as I got to know the culture of the State Department a little bit better, I put that one into the drawer as well. But I kept thinking about these issues that are dear to my heart. So when I did retire 33 years later, believe it or not, after, I don't know, maybe 15 moves, I still had my drafts in my drawer. And I pulled them out and with some trepidation, as you could imagine. And I reread them and I thought, you know what? They're pretty darn good. And the transition when you retire, it's a big change. So there's a lot of mourning that goes on. You mourn a certain lifestyle, more friends. And honestly, these two novels, these drafts, they were my lifesaver. They brought back so much of that old passion that I had to restrain, you know. And as you said, to truly write, you have to be free. And while I tried to be as free as possible within the parameters of my job in the State Department, I did feel constantly that I was in a box, in a framework. And here I just was able to write what I wanted to write, rewrite, improve, I hope. And it was such a joyful experience that I'm not saying that I forgot the sadness of leaving the State Department. Of course, it will always be with me, but I was thinking, there's a second act, and it's been waiting for me for 33 years. I didn't have to, impose it on myself or kind of artificially look for something to do. It was there the whole time. And so that was great.
Yeah, so I think you're in a really interesting position where a lot of writers, they struggle with, oh, how am I actually going to produce something? How am I going to sit down and write it? You already have these full drafts ready. So this would be a good time to ask you about how did you go about, now you have these drafts, you got to publish them, you got to promote it, and you haven't spent those 30 something years in the publishing industry. You spent them being a diplomat. So just did it feel like you started from scratch? How did you go about once you said, okay, I have these works, I want to publish them? What was next?
I'll be honest with you, that was by far the most challenging aspect of my entire odyssey as, my second act as a budding novelist. Because as you said, my job for 33 years was to report on others, to be behind the scenes, not to draw attention to myself. I mean, what kind of a diplomat wants to be the star of their own play, right? And so it was hard for me to get over that hump, to say, okay, you need to promote yourself, the publishing aspect as well. Um, I don't know if you're aware that my father was a novelist. So I grew up with that whole atmosphere of writing and getting published and the excitement of getting that paper book in your hand with your name on it. But when he was writing, it was a completely different atmosphere. He had a publisher. His job was to produce the manuscript. He'd then get the galleys, he'd edit the galleys, he'd send them off, and he was done. And the publisher published the actual product and then promoted it and would get my father on, talk shows or TV or radio or whatever. My father didn't have to do the self promotion. He just had to deliver himself,
No
and that was
social
it.
media.
No, and there was
Yeah.
no social media at all. There were just journalists, who would interview him. But now it's so much more complicated. So much resides on your own shoulders. And I'll be honest with you, I still struggle with that. I had a friend who has a small publishing house, but all they do is they just publish the book. Then it's up to you to promote it. They don't have the skills, they don't have the capabilities, they're not interested. And also, they kind of figure that it's part of your job as an author to be out there on the hustings. And I'm still learning. You and I met when a friend of mine hosted a book launch lunch in Washington, D.C. at the Daco Bacon House. Um, One of her staff helped me set up a website where I'm able to post about this lunch, for example. This podcast is great. Yesterday, I was at a Georgetown University Welcome to the Neighborhood event in Miami, where I spent half my time. And I was able to network with other Georgetown alumni who are writing books. And so we exchanged, impressions and information. That was a lot of fun. It's kind of word of mouth. And of course, I'm trying to get more comfortable with social media as well, with the help, I'll be honest with you, with some of my younger friends. I do a lot of mentoring, both of Georgetown students and of foreign service officers who have just been onboarded, and they're giving me ideas. But it's a work in progress.
Yeah, and you touched on an interesting point. You were kind of talking about with the promotion, you have to do networking. And so I imagine a lot of people, you've gained a lot of contacts throughout your career. You probably know a ton of people in DC and other places, and they know you as this specific person. They know you as a diplomat who has had several postings. And now for some of them, you're kind of reemerging as you say, I'm a novelist now. And what has the response been like to that? How have people generally reacted? Are they kind of intrigued? Like, oh, this is interesting. Are they inspired, or are they kind of confused?
We know it's funny. It's been a mixed bag. I've always gravitated to artists, which was really helpful to me in my career. When I would go abroad, first thing I would do is I would scope out the galleries or go to the theater and try and get behind at the stage and talk to some of the actors. I'm always drawn to creative people. So a lot of my friends in DC, in Miami, are just creative people. They are not diplomats. And they have embraced me. They've been like, oh, Tatiana, you should have done this 15 years ago. And I keep trying to explain, that I couldn't because of the censorship and the sort of, suitability to serve aspect of diplomatic security. And they are so enthused for me. They've read my novel. They're like, this is great. Uh, Keep on writing. You should do more. Unmitigated support. But my diplomatic friends, particularly the other retired ambassadors that I hang out with, I'll be honest with you, I've been met with a certain amount of, how could you? Why are you slumming it? You used to be writing about foreign policy, and now you're writing about what exactly? And as I try to summarize my novel, relationships, basically some somewhat outside the box relationships, like bisexual relationships, or even more outside the box relationships between the dead and the living. And they really don't know what to make of it. Some of them will sort of laugh it off and say, "Oh, that's kind of a beach book, right? But that's kind of a weird theme for a beach book." And some of them will be just like, oh, they don't know what to say. They honestly don't. I'm encouraging them to read my novels, and maybe they'll come around once they've read. But it's been a mixed bag there as well.
And so I think for anybody who says I want to be a writer or even I am a writer, the next step is it requires a certain amount of confidence in a way, or maybe not confidence, but vulnerability. You are putting yourself out there. You're saying, I'm putting out something that I think is good enough for other people to read, maybe even other people to buy and read. And so in that way, do you think getting over that first step, that confidence, do you think that was easier for you coming from your diplomacy career, or do you think it was harder for you in a way?
Um, I think it was easier. Maybe not because of the diplomacy, just because of my personality, but diplomacy certainly reinforced it. I'll give you another example from last night at that Georgetown Welcome to the Neighborhood event, but it's emblematic, literally, of 33 years of diplomacy. You go into a room where you don't know anybody, and for a lot of people, that's daunting, right? But that's the job of a diplomat. Before you've already made your contacts and you have a stable of them, you have to make them, right? And how do you make them? You arrive in a new country, a new city, often with a language you are not particularly good at, but you have to break the ice. And I enjoy doing that. It's not a hardship for me. So what do you do? My technique is you look around, you scan the room, and there are already little cliques, usually people who are happily talking to each other. And then 99 times out of 100, you can spot this one person, or maybe several, but in different parts of the room, and they're alone. They're shy. They wonder, like, am I even, fitting in here? So I always make a beeline for that person. I did that last night. The Miami Welcome to the Neighborhood. And you just introduce yourself and you say, "Oh, if you're here, obviously last night was, oh, if you're here, you're obviously a Georgetown grad. Well, what year did you graduate? I graduated in 83. If you're abroad, you're like, oh, you must be a friend of the British Embassy if you're at the British Embassy." Um, so that part is easy for me. And it certainly was reinforced by my career in diplomacy. And I know that, I'll be honest with you, I know it sounds maybe a little presumptuous, but I really think I'm a good storyteller. I enjoy telling stories and I enjoy hearing stories. And I think that comes across to that shy person at the edge of the room, that I do care about them. I'm interested in what they're going to tell me. And at first, maybe some of them are a little skeptical, but I usually win them over. And and that's why that aspect of writing and then publishing was not that hard for me.
Got it. Okay, that makes the link between the two acts a lot more clear. I think this is a perfect time for us to move on to the lightning round, where we're just going to throw out some questions and you take a minute or so to answer. So first off, what's one book that influenced your approach to writing?
Uh, so I would say there's two, and I know this will sound like kind of like a kooky answer because they, on the surface, they have nothing in common, but actually they do, at least for me. So the first is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. I think it might be the greatest novel ever written, at least for me it is. It's heavy going. Talk about relationships, yes, very heavy relationships. Also a lot about the spiritual, Obviously, you can tell if I write about, love among the living and the dead. I'm very interested in all things spiritual. So Dostoyevsky was truly interested in things spiritual and precisely the relationship between the spiritual and human love and human relationships. I mean, he goes on and on about that, and I love it. But I also think that it's heavy going to describe one person. He'll take 3 pages to describe the personality of this one character. Um, so while I appreciate it, while I love it, I understand that it's not everybody's cup of tea. So the second author that has really influenced my writing is, believe it or not, Agatha Christie. And many people dismiss her as just a crime novelist or the queen of crime or whatever, another beach book type thing. But when you read her carefully, and I have, my favorite is Death on the Nile. So much about relationships. Yes, crime is there, but it's almost incidental to what caused that crime. How did these people come to a situation where they even would contemplate and then commit a crime? Of course, Dostoevsky, he's famous for Crime and Punishment as well. That was one of his preoccupations. Because when you really think about relationships and tragedy and the spiritual, it's all so interrelated. But what Agatha Christie taught me is you don't have to spend 3 pages to describe one character. She was a mistress of encapsulating one person in like 3 sentences. And that person already, you feel like you got to know them. And obviously that means it's a shorter book, it's a more accessible book, but you're not sacrificing the depth of the person that you're describing. And what I really love about writing, which just, for me, at the end of the day, sitting down and writing something, it's like the dessert at the end of my day. I just enjoy it so much. And what brings me joy is imparting people, making them come alive, jumping off that page. And while I learned a lot from Dostoevsky about the depths that you have to go to, I also learned from Agatha Christie how you can summarize it. So the two together really influenced me a lot.
You just convinced me I need to go and read both of them now so I can have my full collection. Okay, great. So what's one piece of advice you would give for someone starting out?
I would say don't invent anything. Don't. Sometimes people misunderstand that a novel is an invention, like a new widget. No, uh, if that's how you go about it, I don't think it'll work very well. I think it'll fall flat. I would say my advice is think about what impacted you most in your life. Could be good. It could be a tragedy. It doesn't have to be a happy ending, but it doesn't have to be a tragedy. It could be something that brought you an enormous amount of joy or understanding. Going to a new country, obviously that's a classic. Something that really impacted you and mind that. Think about it, ruminate upon it, and then try and share it. But to me, writing is sharing something with someone else, someone you'll probably never meet. But you're trying to make your experience, your ideas relevant to other people. That's a tall order. And yeah, you have to have some self-confidence to even attempt it. But I think if you start from the position of this impacted me, this was really important to me, well, let me tell you about it. Maybe not, in a biographical sense, but let me share with you this image of Italy, of whatever. Start with yourself. And then I think, you'll be true to yourself and you'll have something worthwhile to say.
Try to make people feel what you feel through writing.
Yes.
Yeah. And since this is the Hoya Writing Collective, we have to mention Georgetown. So in what way has Georgetown most impacted your career as a writer?
Well, it gave me the beginning of my first novel, that junior abroad in Florence under the auspices of Georgetown, saying that when are you really a novelist? When do you know that you really have something to say? It's when every day you get up and somebody tells you don't write and you write anyway. It's stronger than anything. You have to do it. And so, growing up with a father who was a novelist, I would write little things, as a teenager, and I kind of played around with it. And then I went to Italy back to Georgetown, and I realized I had to get this story out of my. I had to. It wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a necessity. It was a passion, of course, but also a necessity. And Georgetown with its wonderful junior year abroad program, and it gave me that inspiration. It allowed me to do it. I'll always be grateful.
Yeah, and what you said about you have to do it, that's something I've heard a lot with writers is like it's harder not to do it than to do it at some point.
Exactly. That what I quoted was I was quoting Chekhov. I was paraphrasing him, but Chekhov actually wrote it in a little bit more brutal way. He said, every day pay someone to beat you up and say, don't write, don't write, don't write. And if you've done it for a year and you still want to write after all the bruises you have, no, I wouldn't go that far. I don't want to be beaten up.
I don't
But
know, it's kind of effective.
you do have to have that something in you that has to come out.
Yeah. Okay, and so I guess for our last lightning round question, can you give us a heads up on what you're working on next?
Oh, well, maybe I will finally merge. So my creative friends who already like my writing and my diplomatic friends who are skeptical, because my third novel is going to be based on my tour as deputy ambassador in Turkmenistan, which is a little known country in Central Asia, but which teed me up nicely to then become ambassador to Kyrgyzstan, which is in the vicinity, not exactly around the corner, but close enough. So for the first time, I'm going to try and base my, albeit very fictional account, but on embassy life, on um, the aspects of that dépaysement, as the French say, of feeling completely like a fish out of water in a completely new culture, not knowing the language, relations with other embassies, other diplomats. So I'm going to try and mine, finally, my professional life to base a novel on that. So stay tuned.
Yeah, and wow, what a perfect note to end on. So yes, thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us today. This has been such a great conversation. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of The Right Stuff, a GEMA Talks podcast by the Hoya Writing Collective. If you want to learn more, you can go to gema-hoyas.org. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.